The wind in the Wind River Range does not whisper. It howls. It comes down from the peaks with a sound like a grieving woman, sharp and thin, carrying ice that cuts a man's face. Calder Boone paid it no mind. The sound was just noise, same as the silence inside his own head. The cold was just a fact, same as the stone-heavy thing that lived where his heart used to be. He'd been tracking a bull elk for 2 days, and the numbness in his feet was a distant bother. Nothing more. He was a tall man, built thick at the shoulders but worn lean by a grief that burned more calories than hard labor. His beard was frosted, his eyes the color of a winter sky, flat and gray. He moved with a grim purpose, the heavy Sharps rifle resting easy in his grip. The elk was down, butchered with the same practiced, empty efficiency he applied to splitting wood or skinning a rabbit. He loaded the meat onto his pack mule, cinched the ropes, and started the long trek back to the cabin that was less a home and more a place to keep the weather out. He'd built that cabin for Alara. He'd felled the lodgepole pines himself, notched them tight, chinked them with mud and moss to keep out this very wind. He'd built it for a life, for warmth, for the sound of a woman humming and the small, wet cries of his son, Luke. Now there was only the wind. It had been 14 months since he'd buried them. 14 months since the world had ended in a blizzard up on South Pass. He'd tried to get the wagon through, tried to get Alara and the baby to Lander for the doctor. She'd insisted on coming, on not being left behind on the drive. He'd given in. That was his mistake. One of many. The wagon wheel broke, the snow came, and by the time he'd staggered back with help, the cold had taken them. He'd found Alara frozen solid, still holding Luke to her breast, her blue eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Calder had not been the same man since. He was a creature of rage and sorrow, a hollowed-out shell who hunted, ate, and slept, and nothing else. He spoke to no one. The folks in Lander, the few ranchers scattered in the valley. They knew to leave Calder Boone alone. He was a man with a sickness of the soul, and it was catching. He crested the last ridge, the cabin sitting small and dark against the immense, snow-swept valley. The sun was a weak smear of watercolor orange, already dying behind the peaks. That's when he saw it. A smudge of darkness near his barn, half drifted over with snow. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't a wolf. He squinted, his hand going to the pistol on his hip. He'd told them, he'd told everyone, leave him be. His property line was marked clear. He moved closer, the mule snorting behind him, smelling the wrongness in the air. It was a person, a woman. She was face down, collapsed in a heap not 30 yards from his barn door. A drift was already climbing her legs. He saw the tracks of a single horse, shod, heading back east, the hoofprints already blurring with the new falling snow. Rage, cold and sharp, flooded Calder's chest. He knew what this was. Some filthy business from a passing wagon, some soiled dove from a saloon in Cheyenne, dumped and left to die where she wouldn't be a problem. And they'd brought their trash to his door. He stood over her for a long minute, the wind tearing at his coat. Her dress, something that might have been fine once, was dark with meltwater and mud, torn at the shoulder. One boot was gone, the other bloody and split at the toe. Her dark hair was matted with ice. He nudged her with his boot. No movement. He thought, just let the snow take her. It was clean. It was quick. It was what this land did. It scoured things away. He had no room for another person's misery. His own was a full cup, pressed down and overflowing. He'd turned his back on the world of men, and this was the world of men, come crawling to his door. He turned to unload the mule. He'd drag the meat inside, and by morning, the wind would have finished its work. He'd have a problem to bury, but he was good at digging graves. Then he heard it. It wasn't a sound so much as a breath. A faint puff of air that barely snagged on the wind. He stopped, his back to her. He waited. It came again, weaker this time, a broken sigh. And then Words. A whisper so thin it was almost imaginary, terrified and pleading, not to him but to the nightmare holding her fast. "Don't send me back! Please, don't send me back!" Calder Boone swore, a harsh, guttural sound torn from his throat. He swore at the horse tracks, at the woman, at the god who had clearly abandoned this stretch of rock and ice. But most of all, he swore at the small, stupid flicker of something that wasn't dead inside him after all. He turned back. With a groan of frustration, he bent and slid his arms under her. She was light, too light, light as a bundle of dry sticks. He lifted her. Her head lolled back, and in the fading light, he saw her face. It was a ruin. One eye was swollen completely shut, a map of purple and black. Her lip was split. She was young. He carried her toward the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow. He kicked the door open and carried her into the single room. It was cold inside, the fire long dead in the stone hearth. He laid her down on the floor, on the worn bare rug nearest the fireplace, and for a moment, he just stared at her. She was a problem, a complication he neither wanted nor deserved. With rough, impersonal movements, he went to work. He lit the lantern, the yellow light pushing back the shadows. Then he knelt and began to strip the wet, frozen clothes from her body. He did it like he'd butcher a deer, with a detached focus. The buttons were stiff. He pulled his knife and cut the laces of her bodice. He pulled the sodden wool and cotton away, his hands brushing her skin. It was cold as marble. As he worked, the light revealed what the shadows in her clothes had hidden. Dark, ugly bruises mottled her ribs and arms, on her wrists. Raw, red welts circled the bone, rubbed clean through the skin, rope burns, and older scars, thin white lines on her back and thighs, pale against the new, violent discolorations. He stopped, the wet dress in his hand. This was not a saloon girl. This was something else. This was methodical. He felt a different kind of anger now, a low, sick burn in his gut. He quickly grabbed his own spare blanket, a thick wool thing, and wrapped her tightly in it, covering her from chin to toe. He tucked it around her, his movements suddenly less rough. He built the fire fast, stacking the dry pine and aspen, striking a match to the kindling. The flames caught, licking up the wood, and a weak warmth began to spread. He filled the kettle with water from the bucket and hung it over the fire. He took the meat to the lean-to, then came back and sat on his stool, watching her. She was trapped in the fever, her body shivering violently under the blanket. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, and in that fever, her life unspooled in broken pieces, fragments of memory that leaked out into the silent cabin. "No, Father, please, I didn't know he promised." Calder sat still, feeding wood to the fire. He was a man who valued silence, but these whispers filled his cabin, painting pictures he did not want to see. "Julian, you said you loved me, the gardens. Oh God, the shame of it." He saw it, clear as day, a girl with a good name, Annabelle. The name came with a vision of a big white house, a judge's study, the smell of leather books and polish. A smooth-talking man, Julian, with soft hands and a rich suit, whispering promises in a garden, and then the discovery, the disgrace. "Disowned, you cannot be my daughter," sent away a disgrace to the Cartwright name. The fever spiked. She thrashed, her voice rising in terror. "The wagon's so cold, mister. Tate Elijah Tate," he smiled his hands. "No, don't." Caldered hands clenched on his knees. He knew that name. Elijah Tate, a landowner down south, near the Sweetwater, a man with a reputation for cruelty, for buying land and women with the same cold hand. This girl, Annabelle, had been shipped west like freight, disowned by her father, the judge, to be married off to a man like Tate. Her whispers turned frantic, a choked, terrified sob. "The barn is men, they said the boss likes them quiet to break me for fun," ran the horse. "Oh, God, the wood's so cold." She'd run, She'd run from Tate, from his men, and they'd hunted her. The rope burns, the bruises, the swollen eye. They'd caught her, and when they were done, or perhaps when they thought she was dead, they'd ridden off. Or maybe she'd gotten away again, stealing a horse that finally gave out, dumping her here, dumped her on Calder Boone's land, where she'd be one more frozen body come spring. The woman on his floor was not trash. She was a victim. She was Annabelle Annie Cartwright, and she had run through hell, only to freeze on his doorstep. He got up, his joints stiff. He dipped a rag in the now warm water, wrung it out, and knelt beside her. He gently, awkwardly, wiped the blood and grime from her face. Her one good eye fluttered beneath the lid. He held the tin cup of water to her split lips, tipping a few drops in. She swallowed weakly, coughed. He tended her like that for hours, adding wood to the fire, checking the nasty gash on her head, cleaning her wounds as best he could. He did it without speaking, a grim nurse in a silent house. He was just trying to keep a thing alive. He told himself that it was not kindness. It was just a chore. She woke near dawn. The blizzard had hit full force, the wind shrieking around the corners of the cabin, rattling the single glass pane in the window. The fire was roaring. Her eye, the good one, snapped open. It was blue, wide with a terror so pure it was animal. She saw him, a large, bearded shape sitting in the shadows, and she screamed. It was a terrible, broken sound, more air than voice. She tried to scramble backward, to crab walk away from him, tangling herself in the heavy wool blanket, her breath coming in panicked gasps. "No, no more, please." Calder didn't move from his stool. He just raised one hand, palm out. "Stop," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, gravelly. "You're safe. The door's shut. No one's here." She froze, her chest heaving. She stared at him, her gaze flicking from his face to the door, to the rifle leaning in the corner. She was a cornered rabbit, ready to bolt, ready to die from fear. "Where?" "My cabin, Wind River Valley. You were in the snow." He kept his voice flat. No comfort, just facts. She processed this. Her hand went to her face, touching the swollen, bruised flesh of her eye. She flinched. Then her eyes widened again as she realized she was wrapped in a blanket. Nothing else. My clothes." "Wet," he said, nodding toward the hearth where her tattered dress and underthings were hanging, steaming in the heat. "They were freezing to you." She pulled the blanket tighter, a fresh wave of shame and fear washing over her. She looked at him, really looked at him, trying to gauge the threat. He was big, yes, and hard. His face was a mask of old anger, but his eyes, they were not leering. They were just empty. He wasn't looking at her like those men in the barn. He was looking at her like she was a piece of furniture he hadn't expected to find. You didn't." "I didn't," he cut her off, his voice sharp. He was insulted, though he wasn't sure why. "You're hurt. I brought you in from the cold, that's all." He stood up, and she flinched again. Drawing her knees to her chest, he ignored it. He walked to the fire, ladled some hot water into a mug, and stirred in some dried coffee grounds. He turned and set it on the floor, a few feet from where she lay. "Drink it, it's hot." Then he went to the other side of the room, to his own cot, and sat down, his back mostly to her. He pulled out his knife and a piece of wood and began to whittle. The message was clear. He had done his duty. Now she was on her own. They stayed like that for a long time. The only sounds were the howl of the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the scrape of his knife on the wood. Annie watched him, her terror slowly receding, replaced by a deep, aching weariness and a confusion that fogged her mind. He had saved her. He had seen her injuries. He had tended her, and he had not harmed her. This was a kindness so foreign, so unexpected, that she did not know what to do with it. Eventually, her shaking hands reached for the mug, The hot, bitter coffee burned her throat, but it sent a shock of life through her. She drank it all. The blizzard trapped them. For 3 days, the world was nothing but a howling vortex of white. The snow piled up against the door, drifted past the window. The cabin grew smaller, the silence thicker. They lived in a tiny pocket of warmth, 2 strangers bound by the storm. A rhythm established itself, unspoken. Calder would rise first. In the dark, he'd stoke the fire, put on coffee, and go out to the lean-to to feed his mule. He'd come back covered in snow, his face raw, and fry up some jerky or salt pork. He'd put a plate on the floor for her, then eat his own standing by the window, staring out at the white nothing. Annie stayed on the bear rug. Her body was a symphony of pain, but she was a survivor. She'd survived her father's cold rejection, Julian's betrayal, and Elijah Tate's monstrous cruelty. She would survive this. On the 2nd day, she sat up. The room spun, but she clenched her jaw and waited for it to pass. She pulled on her dry clothes, wincing as the rough fabric brushed her raw wrists and bruised ribs. The dress was torn, but it was modest. She needed to be useful. Usefulness was a shield. If she was useful, maybe he would not get angry. Maybe he would not change his mind. I can cook," she offered. Her voice was a hoarse whisper. Calder glanced over from where he was cleaning his rifle. He grunted. "Nothing to cook but salt pork and beans. I can manage." "Please," she said, and there was a desperation in her voice that shamed her. "I must repay you, for the fire." He looked at her, his gray eyes flat. He saw her fear. He saw she was trying to bargain for her life. It made him tired. "There's no repaying," he said, his voice rough. "You're here till the storm breaks. Then you'll move on. Eat the food. Stay warm. That's all." He was pushing her away. He was pushing everyone away. He'd built a wall of ice around himself, and this woman, this broken piece of the outside world, was a threat to it. He hated the way she looked at him, with that mix of terror and gratitude. He didn't want gratitude. He didn't want anything. He especially didn't want another woman in his house, sitting by his fire, reminding him of all the things he had lost. Ilara had cooked at that fire. Ilara had mended his shirts, and he had failed her. This new woman was a walking, breathing reminder of his failure. But Annie was persistent. She saw the cabin was clean, but stark. She saw his mending pile, a torn coat and a pair of wool socks. While he was out checking his traps, a short, brutal trip into the storm. She took the needle and thread from his kit. Her hands were stiff and swollen, her fingers clumsy, but she sewed. She stitched the tear in his coat with small, neat stitches. She darned the sock. When he returned, he saw the coat. He saw the neat repair. He said nothing. He just picked it up, looked at the stitches, and threw the coat onto his cot. But he didn't tell her to stop. So she kept on. She tidied the shelves. She learned to make his coffee just before he woke. She chopped kindling from the wood he brought in, wincing as the small axe sent jolts of pain up her arms. She was trying to make herself small, invisible, and useful. He resisted it. He resisted her. He was bitter, angry at the fate that had brought her here. He saw her as weak. He saw her as all women, soft things that broke, things that this land was not meant for, things he was not meant to protect, because he had failed so badly at it. On the 3rd day, the storm paused, a weary intake of breath before the next assault. The wind died down, and a pale, watery light filled the cabin. Annie stood by the window, breathing on the glass to melt a small patch of frost. She looked out. The cabin was set back in the pines, but from the window, she could see a small clearing, and in that clearing, half buried in the snow, was a small, crude cross made of 2 pieces of aspen, tied with rawhide, and below it, a mound of stones. A grave, a small one, too small for an adult. She stood there for a very long time, her hand pressed to the glass. She understood. She understood the emptiness in his eyes. The hollow space he lived in. This was not just a cabin, it was a tomb. She didn't ask. She knew better. She knew that some grief was too big to be spoken, too heavy to be shared. She turned from the window, her own sorrows feeling small and sharp in the face of that tiny, frozen mound. The storm came back that night, meaner than before. The cabin shuddered under the force of the wind. Calder sat by the fire, staring into the flames, lost in a place she could not go. Annie lay on the rug, pretending to sleep, her back to him. The hours passed. The fire burned low, the cabin cooling rapidly. The wind was the only sound. In the deep, cold dark, just before dawn, she woke. A feeling of wrongness had pulled her from a fitful sleep. The fire was just embers. The room was dark, but she could hear a sound, a quiet, rhythmic, choked sound. She turned her head, slowly. Calder was still on his stool, hunched over, his shoulders shaking. He had his back to her, but she could see him clearly in the faint glow of the dying coals. He was crying. It was not a loud, wailing grief, but a silent, terrible, hopeless weeping that racked his whole body. His face was buried in his hands, and clutched in one of his big, calloused fists. Held up as if in prayer or agony was a tiny, knitted wool mitten. It was blue, worn thin, and impossibly small. Annie lay perfectly still. Her own breath caught in her throat. She did not move. She did not make a sound. She just watched as the man who had saved her, the hard, angry cowboy who swore at the world, finally broke apart in the dark. She watched him mourn his child, and her own tears began to fall, silent and hot, freezing on her cheeks as they ran. When the great blizzard finally broke, the world was too loud. For days, there had been only the scream of the wind. Now, there was the steady, maddening drip, drip, drip of water falling from the eaves, the groan of snow shifting on the roof, the rush of the creek down the valley, swollen and angry. Annie stood at the open cabin door, breathing in the sharp, wet air. It smelled of pine and mud and thaw. Her face was still a map of old pain. The swelling around her eye had gone down, leaving a sickly yellow and purple stain. But she could see from it now. The rope burns on her wrists were scabbing over. She was weak, she was sore, but she was alive. She looked at the man by the fire. Calder was cleaning his rifle, his back to her, a solid, unmoving wall of muscle and grief. He had not spoken a word to her since the night she'd seen him with the mitten. He'd just left food by the fire and gone about his chores, his silence heavier than the snow. She could not stay. She was a burden. She was a ghost at his hearth, a reminder of a world he'd tried to wall out. "Mr. Boone," she said. Her voice was stronger than it had been. He didn't stop his work, but his hands paused on the oiled rag. "I want to thank you," she said, forcing the words out, "for your hospitality, for saving my life. I will be leaving now." He slowly, very slowly, put the rag down. He turned his head and looked at her. His gray eyes were flat, cold as the melt water. "Leaving," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes, I cannot impose any longer. I will find my way to the town." He stood up. He was a tall man, and he seemed to fill the small cabin, blocking out the light from the door. He walked past her and stared out at the valley. The snow was still 3 feet deep in the drifts, a white, glittering trap. "Town's 30 miles, he said, his voice flat. "That's Lander. Rough terrain. You got no horse, you got no food, your boots are split. You'll be dead by sundown." "I cannot stay," she insisted, her voice trembling just a little. She would not be weak. "It is not right." "Right," he scoffed, a bitter sound. "Right has nothing to do with it. This is Wyoming. It's about staying alive. You walk out that door, you'll be wolf meat. I don't feel like tracking your body down to bury it." He turned back to her. "You want to leave? Fine. But you'll wait. You'll wait till the pass is clear, till a wagon comes by, or till I'm going to town for supplies, whichever comes first. Until then, you earn your keep." He was not offering comfort. It was a sentence, but it was also a reprieve. Annie felt a strange, shameful wave of relief. She nodded, pulling her thin shawl tighter. I will earn my keep." "Good," he grunted. He picked up his rifle. "Don't touch my things. Stay out of the chest, and keep the fire going." He left, taking his axe to go clear the path to the barn. Annie watched him go, then shut the door against the cold. Bright air. She must stay. The rhythm of their days changed. It was no longer just two people waiting out a storm. It was two people living. The cabin was grim, practical. It was a man's space, holding only what was needed for survival. But Annie, raised in a judge's house, could not live in starkness. She began to clean, truly clean. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the hearth. She found his meager supply of flour, saw, and lard, and she knew what she could do. One afternoon, Calder returned from checking his trap lines, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. The moment he opened the door, he stopped. The air was different. It didn't smell of old smoke, damp wool, and loneliness. It smelled warm. It smelled of bread. Annie was at the fire, her face flushed with heat, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She'd used a flat, greased pan. Beside her, stacked on a tin plate, was a pile of golden brown biscuits. He stared at them. He hadn't tasted real biscuits since... "It's just I found the flour," she said, her voice small, afraid he'd be angry. "I thought to go with the jerky." Calder said nothing. He hung the rabbits, washed his hands in the bucket, his movements stiff. He walked to the fire. He picked up a biscuit. It was hot. It was light. He broke it open. Steam rose from it. He put it in his mouth. It was soft. It tasted of salt and lard and warmth. It tasted like a home. A sharp, painful memory lanced through him. Ilara, laughing, her hands white with flour. He nearly choked on it. He turned his back on Annie so she wouldn't see his face. He ate the biscuit in 2 bites. Then he took another, and a third. "There's coffee?" she whispered. He just grunted. But it was the first time in a year that the food he'd eaten didn't taste like ash. A week later, he decided she was a liability. Not her presence, her weakness. He came back to the cabin one day and found fresh wolf tracks. Big ones, circling the barn. They were bold. They smelled the mule. And they smelled her. He went inside. Annie was mending her torn dress, her stitches tiny and neat. "Put on your coat," he ordered. She looked up, startled. "What? Why?" "Just do it." Frightened, she obeyed. He grabbed his heavy Sharps rifle from the wall, and then, from the pegs, he took down the lighter Winchester carbine he rarely used. He checked the load. He grabbed a box of cartridges. "Come on." He led her out into the bright, melting snow. The air was warm, a false spring. He walked her 50 yards from the cabin to where he'd set a tin can on a stump. "You know how to shoot?" he asked. A lady's pistol. Once, at a garden party." She felt foolish. He snorted. "This ain't a garden party." He thrust the Winchester into her hands. It was heavy, heavier than she'd expected, and she staggered. The metal was cold. "It's too big," she said. "It's what'll keep you alive. Now, plant your feet. No, wider, like this." He kicked her boot. "Tuck the stock in. Hard. Against your shoulder. Right there." He was impatient, his instructions sharp and without kindness. He was not teaching her. He was arming a weak thing. "It'll kick. It'll hurt. You'll get a bruise. Better a bruise than your throat ripped out. Aim down the barrel. Line up the sights. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Squeeze it." She was trembling. The rifle felt alien, a tool of death. She remembered the men in the barn, their pistols heavy on their hips. "I don't—" "Do it," he commanded. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The rifle slammed into her shoulder, a brutal punch that knocked her back a step, and she cried out. The shot went wild, kicking up snow 10 feet to the left of the stump. "Eyes open," he growled. "You think a wolf is going to wait for you to stop being scared? Again, load it." His harshness steadied her. This was not a request. It was an order for survival. She fumbled with the cartridge, her fingers numb. She levered the round. She tucked the stock hard against the new, blooming ache in her shoulder. She opened both eyes. She lined up the sights. She breathed out, and she squeezed. The rifle bucked, but she held on. The tin can pinged and jumped off the stump. There was a profound silence. Annie stared, her shoulder throbbing, her ears ringing. She had done it. She looked at Calder. His face was unreadable. He just nodded. "Once." "Good enough. Don't waste lead." He turned and walked back to the cabin. Annie watched him go, the heavy rifle suddenly feeling a little lighter in her hands. He hadn't been kind, but he had given her power. He had given her a voice in a land that only spoke in violence. That night, the false spring vanished. A new storm rolled in, a howling blast of ice and wind that reminded them winter was not done. The cabin grew dark again. But something had shifted. When Annie laid out her bedroll, she didn't go to the far corner. She laid it on the bear rug, close to the fire, in the circle of its warmth. Calder was on his cot. Just a few feet away, they were sharing the hearth. In the deepest part of the night, the screaming started. It was not her, it was Calder. "No, God, no, Ilara, the wagon, it's stuck. The wind!" Annie sat bolt upright, her heart hammering. He was thrashing in his cot, tangled in his blankets, his eyes squeezed shut. "Luke, he's so cold, Ilara. Keep him warm. I'll be back. I swear I'll be back." He let out a terrible, broken sound, a sob of pure agony. He was not in the cabin. He was back on South Pass, in the blizzard that had taken his family. Annie scrambled to her feet. She didn't think, she just moved. She crossed the small space and put her hand on his shoulder. It was rigid with tension. "Calder," she said, her voice sharp. "Calder, wake up! You are dreaming! You are here! You are safe!" He woke with a roar, exploding from the cot. He grabbed her wrist, his eyes wild and unseeing. "Get back! Don't touch me!" He shoved her. It wasn't violent, not like Tate's men. It was a desperate, panicked rejection. He shoved her away, and she stumbled back, hitting the cabin wall. He stood there, panting, his hair wild, his eyes slowly focusing. He saw her, Annie, pale and frightened, pressed against the logs. He saw his hand, still raised. The shame hit him like a physical blow. He dropped his arm. He started. He turned away, running his hands through his hair. Get to your bed." Annie didn't move. Her heart ached for him. She was not afraid. "You were dreaming," she said softly, her voice steady. "It was the pass, wasn't it?" He froze, his back to her. He slowly turned. "How did you know?" "I have them too," she whispered, and her own shame was in the words. "Nightmares." He just stared at her, the firelight catching the confusion in his face. "I dream of a barn," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I dream of men's hands. I smell the whiskey on their breath. I hear them laughing. They said they were going to break me. I wake up screaming, but I learned to do it inside, so no one can hear." They stood there in the dark, two broken souls, their ugliest wounds laid bare. The storm howled outside, but inside there was a terrible, shared quiet. Calder looked at her for a long time. He saw the fading bruise on her eye, the old scars on her wrists. He saw her shame, and it mirrored his own. He said nothing. He just turned, picked up his fallen blanket, and climbed back into his cot, his face to the wall. When Annie woke the next morning, Calder was already gone, but on the tin plate by the fire, where he usually left one piece of jerky for her, there were two. The thaw came for real after that. The air grew softer. Patches of green appeared on the hillsides. The grave in the clearing was clear of snow now, the small mound of rocks sharp in the morning light. Annie had waited. She knew she had to. She had to wait until he was ready or until she was brave enough. That evening, they sat by the fire. It was a comfortable silence now, not an angry one. He was mending a piece of tack, his big hands surprisingly gentle with the leather. "Calder?" she asked. He grunted, not looking up. "The grave," she said, her voice soft. "The small one. I saw you that night in the storm, with the mitten." His hands stopped. The cabin went so quiet. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears. She thought he would explode. She thought he would tell her to get out. And this time, he would mean it. He sat for a minute, then two. He put the piece of tack down. He stared into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was dead. It was a voice from a deep, cold place. "Her name was Alara," he said. "My wife." He paused, gathering the words. She hated this land. She was from back east, too quiet for her, too big. She insisted on coming with me on the cattle delivery, over the pass. Didn't want to be left alone. He picked up a stick and poked the fire, though it didn't need it. It was September, too early for snow. But it came. A freak storm. Came down so hard. You couldn't see your hand. The wagon, the axle snapped, up on South Pass. He swallowed. Annie sat perfectly still, her hands clenched in her lap. "I had the horse. I told her to stay. Stay in the wagon. Keep the boy warm. His name was Luke, just 6 months old. I told her to burn whatever she could. I'd ride for help. I swore I'd be back." His voice cracked. "Just once. I rode the horse half to death. Got to a camp. It took 2 days to get back with a sled. The storm, it never let up." He stopped. He stared at the flames, but he was seeing something else. He was seeing the snow. "When I got there, the wagon was just adrift. The fire was long dead. She was in the wagon, frozen. She was still holding him, holding Luke to her chest. She'd wrapped him in every blanket we had, even her own coat. But it wasn't enough." He dropped the stick. Her eyes, they were open. She was looking right at the wagon flap, waiting for me. He finished, and the silence that fell was awful. Annie did not speak. She did not say she was sorry. There were no words for this. She just sat there, and the tears she had held back for her own pain finally came for his. They streamed down her face, silent, hot, and unending. She wept for Alara, for the baby Luke, and for the man who had been forced to bury them alone. He looked over. He saw her, not wailing, not making a show of it, but just grieving with him. Her quiet sorrow was a strange, warm thing. It touched something deep inside him, a place he thought had frozen to stone. He noticed, and for the first time, he didn't feel rage. He just felt empty. The next morning was bright, warm, and full of the sound of birds. A real spring morning. Calder had been checking his fences, his mind fogged. Telling the story had drained him, left him raw. He walked back toward the cabin, and as he got close, he heard it. Singing. It was low and sweet, a lullaby he didn't recognize. He opened the door. The sun streamed in, catching the dust motes. Annie was sitting by the fire, humming, her head bent over her work. She was mending something. He saw the color, blue, faded flannel. He knew what it was. It was Luke's. It was the other shirt, the one from the bottom of the chest, the one he hadn't been able to burn or bury. She looked up, and she smiled. A small, shy, gentle smile. I found this in the chest, she said, her voice soft. It had a hole in the elbow. I thought I could fix it. It was the smile that broke him. It was the lullaby. It was the sight of her, in his wife's chair, holding his son's shirt. It was all too much. The guilt, the failure, the deep, dark rage that he had lived with for 14 months. It all came roaring to the surface. She was replacing them. She was sitting in Alara's light, fixing Luke's clothes, trying to erase what he had lost. "What are you doing?" he whispered. The sound was so terrible. Her smile vanished. I was just... "You had no right," he said, his voice rising, shaking. He crossed the room in 2 strides and ripped the small shirt from her hands. "Calder, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Stop it!" he roared. "Stop trying to fix what you can't. Stop being here." He turned, and with a choked sob of fury, threw the little shirt into the heart of the fire. The dry flannel smoked, sizzled, and then erupted in a bright orange flash. Annie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "Get out!" he breathed. The words were poison. "Get your things! Get out of my house! Get out!" Annie stared at him, at the blazing fire, at the savage, broken look on his face. She was terrified, but this time, she was not just a victim. She stood up. Her face was white, but her eyes were steady. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She walked to the door, grabbed her thin cloak, and pulled on the boots he had helped her patch. "Calder," she said, her voice shaking. "Please." "Go! Just go!" She opened the door and ran. She stumbled out into the bright sunshine, into the mud and melting snow, and she fled toward the woods. She didn't know where she was going. She was just running away from the man who had saved her, the man who had just destroyed her. Calder stood in the cabin, his chest heaving. The smell of burning wool filled the air. He watched the last corner of the blue shirt turn to black ash. The rage was gone, and in its place was a silence so profound, so cold, it was worse than the grave. He saw her empty chair. He saw the needle and thread on the floor. "Annie," he whispered. What had he done? He grabbed his coat and tore out of the cabin, running after her. "Annie, wait! Damn it, stop!" He caught up to her in a small clearing of pale, new-leafed aspen trees. She had stopped, her back to him, her shoulders shaking. "Stop!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. He was angry at her for leaving, angry at himself for yelling, angry at the world. "Where do you think you're going? You'll die out here, you stupid woman! You can't just leave!" She turned around slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes burning with a light he'd never seen before. She was crying, but it was not the weeping of a victim. It was the tears of a woman who had finally had enough. "I know what it's like," she said, her voice low and trembling, but cutting through his fury like a knife. "I know what it's like to carry shame that isn't yours." He stopped dead. He physically stopped, as if he had run into a wall. "What?" "My father," she said, the tears now flowing freely. "He gave me his shame. Julian, the man who ruined me, he gave me his shame. Elijah Tate. He beat me and called me worthless. And that was his shame. And you are drowning in it." She took a ragged, sobbing breath. "It was not your fault. It was the snow. It was the cold. It was an Axel. It was God. It was not you." Her words struck him, one by one, shattering the wall of ice he had built around his heart. He saw her, this woman he had found half dead, standing in the mud, weeping for his sin, for his guilt. Her tears undid him. The strength went out of his legs. The rage, the grief, the 14 months of frozen agony, it all collapsed. Calder Boone fell to his knees in the wet spring earth. He covered his face with his hands. "I swore," he choked out. It was a confession, torn from a place he thought was dead. "I swore I'd never feel anything again. I swore I'm sorry. Annie, I'm so sorry." He was weeping, the hard, dry sobs of a man who had forgotten how Annie watched him for a long moment. The anger drained out of her, replaced by a vast, aching understanding. This was not a monster. This was just a man, as broken as she was. She walked toward him, her steps slow. She knelt in the mud and snow in front of him. She didn't touch him, not at first. "I know," she whispered. He slowly, so slowly, lowered his hands. His face was ravaged, wet with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. She reached out, her hand trembling, and rested it on his shoulder. He flinched, but he did not pull away. And then, as if it was the only thing in the world that made sense, they both leaned forward. He rested his forehead against hers. They stayed there, kneeling in the aspen clearing, two survivors, holding each other up. A few late flakes of spring snow began to fall, silent and white, landing in her dark hair and his matted beard. The wind was quiet, and in the silence, two frozen hearts began, finally, to thaw. That day in the aspen grove, something broke, but something else was forged. When they finally stood, their knees muddy, their faces stained, the air between them was different. It was not easy, but it was honest. They walked back to the cabin in silence. Calder picked up the axe he'd dropped. Annie went to the fire and slowly, deliberately, began to make coffee. He sat on his stool, his head in his hands, not in despair anymore, but in a profound, bone-deep weariness. She brought the coffee to him, a hot tin mug. She didn't put it on the floor. She waited until he looked up and put it directly into his hand. Their fingers brushed. It was the first time they had touched without fear or accident. "Annie," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I know," she said, and went back to the fire. She did not leave. The next morning, she was there, and the next. The unspoken question of her departure had vanished. The snow melted in earnest, and the world turned from white to a fierce, sudden green. The creeks ran high, and the air grew warm. Annie had decided, without asking, to stay for the spring. And with the spring came work. The long winter had been hard on the cabin. "The chinking's come loose on the west wall," Calder said one morning. His voice still gruff, but without the sharp edge. It was just a fact. "Show me what to do," she replied. So they worked. He showed her how to mix the mud and moss, and they packed it into the gaps between the logs with their bare hands. They worked side by side, not speaking much, but moving together. He was stunned by her. She was not strong, not in the way he was, but she was relentless. Her soft hands, which he knew had been raised to hold china cups, became raw and caked with mud, and she never once complained. They moved to the barn roof, where the winter's weight had cracked two of the main supports. He climbed up, and she stayed below, hoisting the new-cut aspen poles up to him with a rope. It was hard, clumsy work. At one point, the rope slipped, and the heavy, green log slammed back to the ground, missing her by inches. Calder's heart stopped. He was down the ladder in a second, his face pale. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, panting, pushing her hair back. I just lost the grip." He stared at her, breathing hard. The old, familiar rage rose, but it was different now. It was not at her, it was at the log, at the rope, at the world that kept trying to harm her. "Be more careful," he snapped, but his voice was tight with fear, not anger. "I will," she said, and picked up the rope again. They ate their meals together, sitting at the small, rough-hewn table he'd built for Alara. At first, the silence was heavy, but slowly, it changed. Annie would talk, not about her past, but about small things, about the color of the Indian paintbrush blooming on the hill, about the taste of the wild onions she'd found near the creek. He started to talk back. He told her how to tell a grizzly's track from a black bear's. He pointed out the eagle that nested on the high ridge. He spoke of the land, the only thing he had ever trusted. and she listened. She found peace in the land. She, who had been raised in drawing rooms, found she was not afraid of the vast, open sky. It did not judge her. It did not whisper about her. It simply was. And Calder, who had found only ghosts in the silence, began to find comfort in her presence. The silence was no longer empty. It was shared. One evening, Annie was trying to split kindling, a task he usually did. She was using the small hatchet, but she was awkward, bringing it down with more fear than force. The blade bounced off the stubborn pine knot. "You're gonna take a finger off," he grumbled from the porch. "I can do it," she said, her jaw set. She swung again, and the hatchet head glanced off, sticking harmlessly in the dirt. She let out a frustrated sigh. Calder watched her. He saw her determination, the flush on her cheek, the way she bit her lip, and a strange, unfamiliar thing happened. It started deep in his chest, a rumble that felt like a cough. He laughed. It was not a laugh he recognized. It was rough, rusty, like a piece of old machinery forced to move. It was a short, harsh bark. Annie froze. She turned and stared at him, her eyes wide. "Cal Calder." He tried to stop. He coughed, clearing his throat, his face turning red. But the sight of her, so fierce and so completely inept with the hatchet, struck him as funny. The rumble came again, this time a real, short laugh. A slow smile spread across Annie's face. It was the first time he had seen her truly smile, without fear or sadness. The light hit her one good eye, and it was the color of the sky after a storm. "It's not funny," she said, but her own voice was trembling with held-back laughter. "I am trying to be useful." "You're useful," he said, the smile still cracking his beard. "But you're a terror with that axe. Give it here, before you hurt yourself." He took the hatchet, and with one easy thwack, split the log clean in two, but he was still smiling, and Annie was, too. Life was settling into a shape, a new shape. Until the day the rider came, they were in the small patch of earth behind the cabin, the one he had fenced off for Ilara's garden, the one he hadn't touched in 2 years. Annie had insisted. She'd found a spade, and they were turning the dark, rich soil, preparing to plant the few beans and potatoes he had left. The sound of the horse made them both freeze. It was not a sound they were used to. Calder looked up, his eyes instantly flat and cold. A man was riding up the valley, slow, wearing a tin star on his vest. "Stay here," Calder said. He picked up the rifle that was always leaning against the cabin wall and walked out to meet the man, standing between the cabin and the stranger. "That's far enough," Calder called out. The deputy stopped his horse, a sway-backed roan. He was a young man, with a thin mustache, and he looked nervous. He knew Calder Boone's reputation. "Mr. Boone," the deputy said, touching his hat. "Just delivering a notice from town." "I don't get notices." "Well, this one ain't exactly for you. It's for a woman you might be sheltering." Calder's hand tightened on the rifle. "I don't shelter anyone." "Look, Boone, I don't want no trouble," the deputy said, clearly wanting just that. "But Elijah Tate, down on the Sweetwater, he's filed a notice. Filed it a month back, but the snow's just cleared. He's looking for his runaway wife, a Miss Annabelle Cartwright." Annie, who had been hidden by the corner of the cabin, stepped out. Her face was pale. The deputy saw her. His eyes went wide. "Well, I'll be, ma'am. Are you Annabelle Cartwright?" Annie looked at Calder, then at the deputy. She nodded. "I am—" The deputy licked his lips, pulling a rolled piece of paper from his saddlebag. "Then I got to serve you this Mr. Tate has filed a bounty, $50. He claims you run off with his horse, $200 in cash, and a gold watch. Says you're a thief." "That is a lie," Annie said, her voice shaking, but cold. "Be that as it may, ma'am, He's got a writ, and he's got bounty hunters out. Not to mention, he's filed a marriage contract with the circuit judge. By law, you're his property." Calder took a step forward. His voice was so low, it was barely a rumble. "Get off my land." "Now, Boone, I'm just doing my job." Calder raised the rifle, not to his shoulder, but holding it level. "I said, get off my land. You tell Tate. You tell the marshal. You tell anyone who asks she ain't here. You never saw her. You understand me?" The deputy's eyes darted from Calder's face to the rifle, then to the woman. He saw the fading bruise on her eye. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. "He's a powerful man, Boone," the deputy stammered. "And I'm a man with nothing to lose," Calder said, his voice dead. "You got 3 seconds to turn that horse around." The deputy didn't wait for 2. He yanked the reins, the roan spinning in the mud, and kicked it into a nervous trot. Back down the valley, Calder watched him until he was out of sight. Then he lowered the rifle, but he didn't put it down. He could feel Annie shaking behind him. He turned to her. "Go inside," he said. "Pack your things, the ones I gave you." "What? Why? Where are we going?" "Not we, you," he said, his face a mask of stone. "There's an old line cabin up on the North Ridge. It's hidden. He'll never find you there. I'll bring you supplies. You can stay there till this blows over." He was already moving, gathering a blanket, a sack for flour. He was going back to his old ways, hiding, running. "No." He stopped. He thought he'd misheard. "What did you say?" "No," Annie said, and this time her voice was strong. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the door. I will not hide in a cabin. I will not live in a hole like a frightened rabbit. I ran from my father's house. I ran from Elijah Tate. I am not running anymore." "This ain't a discussion. Annie," he roared, the fear making him angry again. "This is Tate. He has bounty hunters. He has the law. They will drag you back there. And what they did to you before, it'll be nothing? Nothing. I will not let that happen." "And I will not let you throw your life away hiding me," she cried, her fists clenched. "I am not a piece of property. I am not a thief, and I am not his wife. I am tired of being ashamed for what other people have done. I want justice, not shame." He stared at her, dumbfounded. This was not the broken woman he had pulled from the snow. This was someone else. This was someone strong. "Justice?" he scoffed. "There's no justice in Lander. There's just Tate's money and a weak-kneed marshal. He will win. Then he will win with me looking him in the eye," she said. "I will go to town. I will tell the marshal my story. I will tell them what he did. I will not be branded a thief." He looked at her for a long, hard minute. He saw the set of her jaw. He saw she meant it. She would go, with or without him. And if she went alone, she was dead. "Damn it," he whispered. "Damn it all. You are the most stubborn, foolish, fine. We'll go to town. We'll go see the marshal. But we do it my way." He looked at her, his eyes raking over her torn, muddy dress, her hair tied back with a piece of string. "But not like that," he said, his voice suddenly softer. "You'll not go into that town looking like a victim. You'll go in looking like a lady." He turned and walked to the big wooden chest at the foot of his cot, the one she'd been warned not to touch, the one that held Alara's things. He opened it. The smell of cedar and old lavender drifted out. He reached inside and pulled out a dress, folded neatly. He shook it out. It was blue, a soft, cornflower blue wool, with simple white stitching at the collar and cuffs. It was Alara's best dress, the one she'd been married in. He held it out to her. His hand was shaking. "Calder," Annie whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "I can't. This is hers." "She's gone," he said, his voice thick. "She's gone, and you are here, and you are strong, and I want them to see you. Not him, not your father, you. Slowly, her hands trembling, she took the dress. The next morning, they rode out. He put her on his mule, and he walked beside her, the rifle in his hand. Annie had washed. She had brushed her dark hair until it shone, coiling it in a simple, elegant bun at the nape of her neck. The blue dress fit her as if it were made for her. The color brought out the blue in her good eye, and the high collar hid the last of the fading bruises. She was pale, but she was beautiful, and she looked strong, radiant. When she'd stepped out of the cabin, Calder had to stop breathing for a moment. He was stunned. It wasn't just the dress. It was her. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. He wasn't seeing Alara's ghost. He was seeing Annie Cartwright, and she was magnificent. The ride to Lander was 30 miles of silence, but it was a different silence. It was the quiet of two soldiers marching to a battle. They came over the last rise, and the town of Lander spilled out below them. It was a muddy, rough collection of false-fronted buildings, loud with the sound of hammers, shouting men, and wagon wheels sucking at the mud. As they moved down the main street, everything stopped. Men quit their work. Women, peering from the windows of the mercantile, stopped and stared. They saw Calder Boone, the wild, grieving man from the mountains, and they saw the beautiful, strange woman riding his mule, dressed in a fine blue dress. The whispers started immediately, a low, ugly sound, like snakes in dry grass. "That's him, Boone." "Who's the woman?" "That's her. That's the one. Tate's runaway. I heard she stole his money. A whore from Cheyenne. Look at her, bold as brass." Annie kept her head high, her eyes fixed straight ahead, on the marshal's office. She could feel the stairs like small, hot needles. Calder walked beside her, his face a mask of cold fury. His hand was white on the stock of his rifle. Every whisper, every name, was a spark on dry tinder. But he said nothing. He just kept walking. They reached the marshal's office. Calder tied the mule. "Stay here," he said. "No," Annie said, sliding off the mule's back before he could help her. "I will speak for myself." They walked in together. The marshal, a man named Elias Thorne, looked up from his desk. He was an older man, his face worn with the stress of trying to keep peace in a lawless land. "Boone," he said, surprised. "Didn't expect to see you. And ma'am." "Marshal?" Annie said, her voice clear. "My name is Annabelle Cartwright. I am told Elijah Tate has filed a complaint against me." "He has, ma'am," Thorne said, sighing. "A serious one. Theft and desertion of a marriage contract." "He is lying," Annie said. "He is not my husband. He and his men." Before she could finish, the door of the office swung open, slamming against the wall. "Well, well, speak of the devil, and she appears." Annie froze. She knew that voice. It was smooth, like oil and just as slick. Elijah Tate stood in the doorway. He was not what she expected. He was not a rough brute. He was handsome, in a cruel, sharp way. Dressed in a fine black suit and a silk vest, he smiled, but it never reached his cold, dark eyes. Behind him stood two men. They were not well dressed. They were hired guns, their pistols worn low and tied down. They looked at Calder, and they smiled. "Two." "Annabelle, my dear," Tate said, stepping into the room. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, stealing my horse, my money, and running off. It was very rude. I had to hire these gentlemen to find you." "I stole nothing," Annie said, her voice shaking but full of ice. "I ran to save my life. From you." "Did she now?" Tate laughed, looking at the marshal. "She's prone to flights of fancy. Marshal, a delicate constitution." He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on the blue dress. "And now I find you in the company of this mountain man, and wearing another woman's clothes. Tisk, such a disappointment." Calder stepped forward, moving so he was squarely between Annie and Tate. He was a full head taller than Tate, and where Tate was sleek, Calder was rock. "You'll not speak to her," Calder said. His voice was a flat, deadly monotone. Tate looked at him, his smile fading. "And who are you?" "Her new protector. You're interfering in a domestic matter, Boone, and in my property." "She ain't your property." "She is," Tate hissed. "I have a contract, signed by her father, the judge, and I have a bounty. Marshal, I want my wife, and I want this man arrested for harboring a thief." The marshal looked from Tate to Calder, then to Annie. He saw her face. He saw Calder's hand on his gun. He saw Tate's hired men, their hands hovering near their belts. "Enough!" Thorne yelled, slamming his hand on his desk. "This is a hearing, not a saloon brawl. Tate, you claim theft. Annie, you claim something else. I am not a judge, but I am the law. We will have a proper hearing. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, in this office. Until then, everyone stands down." "Tomorrow?" Tate said, outraged. "Tomorrow," Thorne repeated. "And Annie, ma'am, I can't let you go. It's either the cell or Boone. You vouch for her? You'll be at the inn." "We'll be at the inn," Calder said. "Fine," Tate sneered. "One more night. But tomorrow, she is mine. By law." He tipped his hat to Annie, a mocking gesture, and turned, his two men backing out slowly after him. The office was silent. Annie was trembling so hard, she had to grip the back of a chair. "Boone," the marshal said, his voice low. "You watch your back. Tate don't play fair, and those two men with him, they're bad news." Calder just nodded. He put his hand on Annie's back. "Let's go." He walked her to the town's only inn, a 2-story wooden building next to the saloon. The whispers followed them all the way. He paid the innkeeper for 2 rooms, his face grim. They walked up the stairs. Their rooms were next to each other, small, dark, and smelling of stale whiskey. Calder checked her room first, looking under the bed, checking the window lock. "Keep this locked. I'll be right next door." "Calder," she said. He turned. She was standing in the middle of the small, shabby room, looking lost. The blue dress seemed too bright for the space. "He will win," she whispered. "The marshal, he said it. Tate has a contract." Calder walked back to her. He stood in front of her, his big, rough hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He wanted to tell her it would be fine. He wanted to promise to protect her, but he knew, in this town, his rifle was not enough. "We'll face it tomorrow," he said, his voice rough. "Just get some rest." He turned to go to his own room. "Calder, wait." He stopped at the connecting door. "Thank you," she said, for standing between us, for not letting him look at me." He nodded, his throat tight. "I was so afraid," she whispered, mostly to herself. "All those months, running from my father, running from him, I was so afraid. But today, walking down that street, with them all whispering, I wasn't afraid. Not really, because you were there." She looked up at him, her good eye clear and shining in the dim light. She took a step closer to him. "I trust you," she said, her voice soft, but with a powerful, ringing truth. "After all of it, I trust you, with all that I am." Her words hit him harder than Tate's threats. Her trust. It was a gift, a terrifying, precious gift that he knew he hadn't earned. He looked at her face, at the last shadow of the bruise, at the strength he had not seen, at the woman who had faced down her own shame and his. He had sworn he would never feel again. He had sworn his heart was buried on the hillside. He was wrong. Slowly, as if he were moving in a dream, he raised his hand. His calloused, rough fingers gently touched her cheek. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, a soft sigh escaping her. He leaned down. He was awkward. He was a man of rock and ice, not of softness, but he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of desperation. It was a kiss of promise. It was his lips, chapped and rough from the wind, pressing against hers. It was a quiet, profound, and heartbreaking thing. It was the first time in his life he had kissed a woman not in hope, but in reverence. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, just as they had in the clearing. "Get some rest, Annie," he whispered, his voice thick. He went to his own room. That night, they slept in their separate, cold beds, with the connecting door wide open. And sometime in the deep, dark hours, as the sounds of the saloon raged and then died, Calder reached out his hand into the darkness, and Annie's hand found his. They held on, their fingers laced together beneath the covers, two islands clinging to each other in a hostile dark. The marshal's office was hot, and it smelled of old tobacco, sweat, and fear. It was not a big room, and it was filled. Men stood in the doorway, shoulder to shoulder. Women who would not normally set foot in such a place stood in the back, their faces tight with judgment and a sharp, hungry curiosity. Elijah Tate stood by the marshal's desk, cool as a winter morning. He was dressed in his fine black suit, and he held a sheaf of papers. His two hired men, a lean one called Slater and a thick-shouldered one called Cole, flanked the only door. Calder stood in the corner, his back to the wall, his rifle held easy in the crook of his arm. He said nothing. He just watched. Annie sat in the chair Marshal Thorne had offered her. She wore the blue dress. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was so still. She looked like a painting. "All right," Thorne said, rubbing his tired eyes. "This ain't a formal court, but it is a formal hearing. Mr. Tate, you've made a claim of theft, and you've filed a marriage contract. State your piece." Tate smiled, a thin, oily gesture. "It's simple. Marshal, this woman, Annabelle Cartwright, was promised to me a legal, binding contract signed by her father, Judge Thomas Cartwright, as proxy. She is, by the law of this territory, my wife." He slapped the papers on the desk. "She arrived at my ranch, and then, in the night, she stole a horse, $200 from my study, and a gold watch that belonged to my grandfather. She fled. These injuries, she claims they are the inventions of a hysterical, ungrateful woman, likely got from falling off the horse she stole." A murmur went through the room. It was a solid, believable story. Money, a horse, a runaway woman. "He is lying," Annie said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring. Tate turned on her. "Lying, my dear? Are you denying you signed the papers?" Annie looked at the marshal. "I did sign them, sir, back east. I signed them because my father, he was sending me away. I was told Mr. Tate was a man of character. I was told I would be his wife." "And so you are," Tate said smoothly. "No," Annie said, and she stood up. The room felt suddenly colder. "When I arrived, I was not treated as a wife. I was locked in my room. Mr. Tate informed me that my father had been paid handsomely for the arrangement, and that I was now his property." She was shaking, but her voice was steady. When I refused his attentions, he did not like it. He said I was unbroken. He said I required training. He called in his men." She looked at Slater and Cole, who just smirked. "He told them to teach me my place. To break me was the word he used. I ran. I hit one of them with a water pitcher, and I ran to the barn. I took the first horse I could find. I took no money. I took no watch. I ran for my life. What they did when they caught me." She stopped, her hand going to her throat. She could not say the rest. Not here. Not in front of these staring, hungry faces. "I did not steal from him. I escaped him." Tate let out a sigh, as if he were dealing with a difficult child. "Marshal, this is slander. A fantasy. Look at her. She's run to this wild man." He pointed at Calder. "A man who lives like an animal, who hides from decent folk. What did you promise her? Boon? A cut of my money? What hold do you have on her?" This was the moment. Calder, who had not spoken to a room full of people in 2 years, took a step forward. The crowd in the doorway parted, as if by magic. He was not looking at Tate. He was looking at the marshal, but his voice was for the town. "My name is Calder Boone," he said. The room was dead silent. You all know me, or you think you do. You know I live alone. You know I lost my wife, my son." The women in the back, the ones who had been whispering, looked down. This was a grief they respected. "I ain't been to town. I ain't spoke to no one. That's true. I had nothing left to say. Until I found her." He nodded toward Annie. "I found her on my land. In the snow. A day, maybe 2, from dead. I did not find a thief. I found a woman who had been hurt bad." He took a step closer to the desk, his voice a low, hard rumble that filled the room. Her eye, the one she's still favoring, it was swollen shut, black as a boot. Her lip was split. She had rope burns on her wrists, rubbed raw. She was half frozen and beaten near to death. He turned, his flat, gray eyes landing on Tate. "A man who has a legal contract. Marshal, he don't need to do that. A man who wants his wife back, he comes with the law. He don't come with this." He pointed at Slater and Cole. "He don't hire bounty hunters. He don't hire men who look like that. This ain't a husband. Marshal, this is a man who bought a thing, and it broke, and he's angry." The silence that followed was profound. Calder's words, simple, honest, and brutal, had landed like stones. They were frontier people. They understood land, and they understood contracts. But they also understood violence. They looked at Tate's fine suit and his soft hands, and then at his 2 gunmen. They looked at Annie, standing tall in her blue dress, the faint yellow shadow still visible on her cheek. And they looked at Calder, a man of their own, a man broken by grief, who was risking what little he had left to tell the truth. The whispers started again, but they were different now. "Rope burns. He's right. Look at those 2. Tate's always had a bad name." Marshal Thorne saw the tide turn. He was the law, but he was also a man. He slammed his hand on the desk. "Mr. Tate, you got a contract. That's a civil matter. You want to argue it. You take it to the circuit judge in Cheyenne. I got no power over that." Tate smiled. "So, she's mine." "But," Thorne said, his voice hard, "this claim of theft, I don't see no thief. I see a woman who, by your own admission, was fleeing your ranch, and I got Mr. Boone's testimony on her condition. So the bounty, that's void. In this jurisdiction, it's void. I'm tearing up your writ. Mr. Tate." Tate's smile vanished. His face went dark. "You can't—" "I can, and I am," Thorne said. "And as for the charge of theft, I'm dismissing it. Lack of evidence." He looked at Annie. "Ma'am, as far as the law in Lander is concerned, you are free to go, free." He then looked at Tate, his hand resting on his pistol. "And I am strongly suggesting you and your men find business elsewhere. Your business here is done." Tate's face was a mask of pure fury. He snatched his contract off the desk. He gave Annie a look of such cold hatred that she flinched. He turned and stormed out of the office, Slater and Cole following him, shoving men out of their way. The room let out a collective breath. "Calder," Annie whispered. He was already at her side. "Let's go," he said, his hand on her back. "Let's go home." They walked out of the marshal's office, into the bright, muddy street. The townsfolk made way for them, their eyes no longer hostile, but full of a new, quiet respect. Annie held her head high. She had faced him, and she had won. They were halfway to the mule when Tate's voice cut through the air. This ain't over, Boone! He was standing by his horse, in front of the saloon. His men were with him. And you! He screamed, his voice raw with humiliation, pointing at Annie. You think you're free? You are a ruined whore. You'll be back, begging me, before I'm done. Calder, who had been calm through the whole hearing, went rigid. The word whore was a lit match. He started to move, his hand dropping to the pistol on his hip. But Slater and Cole were ready. They stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Hold on, mountain man. Slater sneered, his hand on his own gun. The boss is talking to the lady. Get out of my way, Calder growled. Slater shoved him. Make me. Calder was not a gunman. He was a fighter. He shoved back, a hard, brutal push that sent Slater staggering back into the mud trough. Cole cursed and went for his pistol. Calder moved, fast for a big man, and hit Cole in the jaw, a crack of bone on bone. But he was watching the two men. He was not watching Tate. Tate, his face purple, pulled a small, silver derringer from his vest pocket. He aimed it, not at the man fighting his hires, but at the woman who had defied him. He aimed it at Annie. No! Calder roared. He saw it. He didn't think. He threw himself sideways, a desperate, lunging movement, shoving Annie hard against the wooden wall of the mercantile, shielding her with his own body. The derringer fired. It was a small, sharp pop, almost lost in the noise of the street. Calder grunted, a sharp, choked sound. He stumbled back, his left hand flying to his side, just above his hip. The street fell silent. Tate, drop it! Drop it now! Marshal Thorne was on the boardwalk, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at Tate's chest. Slater and Cole froze, their hands raised. Tate, his face a mask of shock, looked at the smoking derringer in his hand as if he didn't know how it got there. He saw the shotgun. He saw the entire town staring at him. He threw the small pistol in the mud. He attacked me! Tate shrieked. You all saw it! He attacked me! Get on your horses! Thorne commanded, his voice shaking with rage. All three of you, and you ride out of this county. If I ever see your faces again, I will jail you for vagrancy, I will jail you for assault, and I will jail you for attempted murder. Now, get! Tate gave Annie one last look, a look that promised death. Then he scrambled onto his horse. He and his men kicked their mounts into a gallop, splashing mud and filth, and disappeared down the valley. The street was quiet for a second. Then Annie screamed. Calder! He was leaning heavily against the wall of the mercantile. His face was a sickly, pale white. His hand was clamped to his side, and between his fingers, dark, arterial blood was gushing, painting the blue wood of the wall. It's all right, he wheezed, but his knees were buckling, and he began to slide down the wall. She rushed to him. No, no, no! She saw the blood. She didn't panic. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the hem of the beautiful blue dress, Ilara's dress, her dress of strength, and she ripped it, a long, tearing sound of wool giving way. She wadded the thick cloth and shoved it hard against the wound. Hold this, she commanded him. Press on it, hard. He groaned, his eyes squeezing shut as she pressed down. She put her arm around his back, holding his full weight against her, her own small body trembling with the strain. I have you, she whispered, her voice fierce, tears streaming down her face. I have you. You are not leaving. Do you hear me? You are not leaving. The town doctor pushed through the crowd. Get him inside. Get him on a table. Now! The bullet was small, and it had passed clean through the thick muscle of his side. It was a miracle. It had missed his kidneys, missed his spine. He's lucky, the doctor said, tying off the last bandage. An inch to the left, but he's lost a great deal of blood. He'll be weak as a kitten for a week, and he'll have a fever. You keep this clean. You watch him. The ride back to the cabin was the longest journey of Annie's life. They borrowed a wagon. and she laid him in the back on a bed of straw. Every rock, every rut in the road, sent a fresh jolt of pain through him, and he would groan, his body rigid. She sat beside him, holding his hand, speaking to him in a low, soft murmur, though she wasn't sure he could hear. They got him inside, back to the small, safe cabin. She got him out of his bloody clothes and into his cot. He was pale, his skin clammy. The fever was already taking hold. The roles were reversed. He was the patient, she was the nurse. And she tended him, just as he had tended her. She washed the dried blood from his skin, her touch gentle and sure. She boiled rags for compresses. She sat by his cot, day and night, as he drifted in and out of a fevered, mumbling sleep. He was back on the pass, calling for Elara. He was back in the street, shouting, "No!" "I am here," she would whisper, wiping his face with a cool, wet cloth. "I am here. Calder, you are safe. You are home." She brewed broth from a rabbit she shot herself, with the rifle he had taught her to use. She forced spoonfuls of it between his chapped lips. She did not sleep. She just watched the rise and fall of his chest, watched the life she had pulled back from the brink. On the third night, the fever broke. He woke slowly. The cabin was dark. A single lantern burned on the table, casting a low, golden light. His side was a deep, throbbing ache, but his mind was clear. He turned his head. Annie was asleep in the chair, her head fallen forward onto the edge of his cot. Her dark hair was loose, falling around her face. Her hand was resting on the blanket, just inches from his. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes. He saw the strength in that small, worn face. He saw the torn hem of her blue dress, which was hanging on the peg, stained dark with his blood. She had faced down her past. She had faced down his. She had taken a bullet for him, in a way, and she had ripped her own dignity, that dress, to save his life. He could feel a strange, tight feeling in his chest. It was not pain. It was something else, something vast. He coughed, a dry, weak sound. Her head snapped up, her eyes, wide and frightened in the dim light, found his... "Calder? Hey," he whispered. His voice was a rasp. "You're awake," she breathed. "The fever, it's gone." She put her hand on his forehead. It was cool. "Oh, God, Calder." Tears of pure, exhausted relief welled and streamed down her face. She dropped her head onto the cot and sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't cry." I thought I lost you." She wept into the blanket. "After all that I thought he had, I thought I lost you." He reached out his good hand, the one that wasn't on his bandage side. It was weak, but he found her hair. He stroked it. "You didn't. I'm here." She looked up at him, her face stained with tears, beautiful in the lantern light. The tiny cabin was silent, a fortress against the world. They had been through the fire, both of them. There were no more walls. There were no more ghosts. There was nothing left between them but the truth. She stood up. She did not say a word. Her eyes never left his. Slowly, her hands trembling, she began to unbutton the simple work dress she had put on. She unbuttoned the cuffs. She pulled it over her head and let it fall to the floor. She stood in her thin white chemise. He watched her, his heart pounding a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. She untied the small ribbon at the neck of her chemise. She did not look away. There was no shame in her. There was no fear. This was not a surrender. This was a choice. Her choice. She was pale in the light, her ribs visible, the old thin scars on her back and arms like faint writing on a page. She was a survivor, and she was his. She pulled back the heavy wool blanket from his cot. He winces as the air hit his bandaged side. She climbed in beside him, so carefully, so gently, her skin barely touching his. He was weak. He was hurt. I'll hurt you, he whispered. No, she said, her voice soft as moths. You won't. She lay beside him, her head on his good shoulder, her arm draped carefully across his chest, her hand resting over his heart. They lay like that for a long, long time, just breathing. The only sound was the low crackle of the fire. He could feel her tears, hot, falling onto his skin. Annie? I never knew, she whispered, her voice thick. I never knew it could be like this. I thought it was only fear. I thought it was only pain. He turned his head. His lips found hers. They kissed. It was not the desperate, shy kiss at the inn. It was a kiss of deep, profound, and slow certainty. It was the kiss of a man who had been in the grave and was tasting life. It was a kiss that said, "You are home." And there, in the quiet cabin, surrounded by the vast, dark wilderness, they made love. It was slow. It was tender. It was full of held-back tears and whispered words of healing. It was not a fire. It was a warmth. It was the mending of two souls that had been torn apart by the world, now stitching themselves together. Afterward, they lay tangled, her head on his chest, her breath warm on his skin. He was weak, exhausted, but his heart, the one he thought had frozen and died, was beating so strong it felt like it would break his ribs. He stroked her hair, his hands shaking. He held her. He leaned down and whispered into her hair, his voice so low, it was just a breath. You melted the last of it, didn't you? The ice. She lifted her head, her eyes shining in the dark. She kissed his lips, then his rough cheek. There was nothing to melt. Calder, she whispered. It was always there. It was just buried. The days that followed were like the first days of a new world. Calder healed. His strength came back, but the old, bitter coldness in his eyes was gone. It had been washed away. He laughed. He laughed a real, easy laugh when she, trying to be helpful, spooked the mule and sent it running. They were a team. They planted the garden, their hands in the same soil. They repaired the barn roof, working together. They talked. They planned. This land, he said one afternoon. They were standing on the porch, his arm wrapped around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder. This bottom land is good, rich. We could buy the parcel south of here. Run a small herd. Not big, just ours. He looked down at her. As a team. She turned her face up to his. I would like that. Calder, I would like that more than anything. He was talking about a future. He was talking about hope. The peace was so deep, it felt like it would last forever. It lasted until the mail rider came. He was on his way to a new settlement up north, and he carried a pouch. Got a letter, he said, squinting at the worn envelope. For a Miss Annabelle Cartwright. Been sittin' in Lander for a good while. Came all the way from Philadelphia. Annie's hand shook as she took it. She recognized her father's crest on the wax seal. She waited until the rider was gone. She sat on the porch step, Calder standing over her. She broke the seal. She read the letter. Her face went white. The paper fluttered from her fingers to the wooden boards. Annie, what is it? What's wrong? She stared at the barn, her eyes wide and unseeing. He's dying, she whispered. My father. Calder's heart, the one that had just learned to beat again, went cold. He's asking for me, she said, her voice hollow. He says he wants my forgiveness. Before he goes, he says he knows he was wrong. Calder looked at the letter, then at her. Back east, Philadelphia. It was another world, a world of judges and gardens and rules, a world that had cast her out, a world that was now trying to pull her back. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a terrible, tearing anguish. Calder, I don't know what to do. I hate him. For what he did, for sending me away. Do you? Calder asked, his voice quiet. I don't know, she wept. He is my father. Calder's first thought, The selfish, dark thought of the old Calder was to say no, to tell her to stay, to hold on to her. But he looked at her. He looked at the woman who had faced down Tate, who had nursed him, who had trusted him with her very soul. He knew what he had to do. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He knelt in front of her, taking both her hands in his. They were rough now, like his. "Annie, look at me." She met his gaze, her eyes swimming. "You came here," he said, his voice thick. "Running from shame. Your father's shame. Tate's shame. You faced him. You beat him. You're free of him. But this is the last piece. This is his last hold on you. If you don't go, that hate, it'll stay here. It'll be a ghost in this cabin. It'll be a ghost between us. You'll never be free." "But I can't leave you," she cried, clutching his hands. "This is my home. You are my home. I don't care about him." He pulled her to her feet, pulled her into his arms, and held her so tight he could feel her heart beating against his. It was tearing him in two. "I'll be here," he whispered, his voice breaking. "This cabin, this land will be here. Waitin'. You saved me, Annie. You walked into my darkness, and you pulled me out. You saved my life." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs wiping her tears. "Now, you go save yourself. Go see your father. Go and bury your ghosts. All of them. And then you can come home. For good." The stagecoach ride was a rattling, swaying hell. It was a journey back in time, back into a world that felt like a dream. Every mile east took Annie further from the sharp, clean air of the Wind River, and deeper into the damp, coal-smoked haze of civilization. Calder had sold his winter's cache of furs, all of it, to buy her ticket. He had stood by the road, his face like stone. As she climbed into the coach and landed, he didn't touch her. He didn't say he loved her. He just looked at her, his gray eyes saying everything. "Be free," they said. "Come home." Philadelphia was not a city. It was a prison of brick and noise and memory. The Cartwright estate was just as she remembered it. Too large, too quiet, the air smelling of floor wax, old money, and regret. Her father was in his study. He was not the booming, red-faced judge she remembered. He was a frail, shrunken man, lost in a velvet smoking jacket, a plaid blanket across his knees. His hands, the ones that had signed the paper sending her to Tate, were thin as bird claws, spotted with age. He saw her, and his eyes, watery and pale, filled with a terrible, desperate shame. "Annabelle," he whispered. It was the first time in 2 years he had used her name. "Father," she said. Her voice was steady. It was the voice that had spoken to Marshall Thorne. It was not the voice of the girl who had fled this room. You look," he searched for a word. "You look well." "I am well," she said. "No thanks to you." The coldness in her voice made him flinch. "I know," he choked out. I received a letter from a Marshall Thorne in Wyoming. He told me what that man was, what I sent you to." "You did not send me," Annie said, standing over him. "You sold me. You sold me to hide your shame." "Yes," he wept, the great Judge Cartwright weeping like a child. "Yes, I was a fool, a proud, cruel fool. My name, my reputation, I thought it was everything. I threw away my daughter, my only Annabelle. Can you find it in your heart?" She looked at him, this broken man, and she felt nothing, not hatred, not anger, just a vast, cold pity. This was the man who had terrified her. This was the man whose approval she had craved, and he was just small. "I forgive you," she said. The words came out, and they felt true. She was not forgiving him for his sake. She was doing it for hers. She was cutting the last rope. "I forgive you, Father, but I will not forget." He grabbed her hand, his own so cold, and pressed it to his wet cheek. "Thank you," he sobbed. "Thank you." She stayed for a week. Her father, his confession made, seemed to let go. He slipped into a haze, and 2 days later, he died in his sleep. Annie was now the mistress of the estate, the sole heir. The whispers started at the funeral. Annabel Cartwright heard she was in the West looked so weathered. My dear, the shame of it. And now she gets everything. She faced them. The former friends who had cut her dead in the street. The gossips who had picked her name apart. And she faced Julian. He came to the house the day after the funeral, dressed in a perfect black suit, his face a mask of sorrowful concern. He was handsome, just as she remembered, and just as empty. "Annie," he said, taking her hand. She did not pull away. She just let her hand lie limp in his, a cold, dead thing. "I heard about your father and about your ordeal. It is a tragedy. I never forgway myself, for my part in it." "Did you not?" she asked, her voice calm. "Never. I was a fool, a boy. But I am a man now, and you are alone. Let me help you. Let me restore your name, the Cartwright name. Let me give you the comfort, the status you deserve. Marry me, Annie. Let me make it right." She looked at his soft hands, his polished shoes. She thought of Calder's hands, calloused and scarred, strong and gentle. She thought of the mud in the garden, the smell of pine, the feeling of his lips on hers. She pulled her hand from his. Mr. Duponte," she said, using his last name. "I am not alone, and I am not in need of comfort. The life you are offering this house, this money, this name, it is a cage. I have been in a cage before. I prefer the sky." "The sky?" he said, confused. "I am returning to Wyoming. I have a home there, and a man, a better man than you will ever be." "A cowboy?" he scoffed, his mask slipping, the old arrogance showing. "A savage? After all this, you choose that?" "I choose a man who stood between me and a bullet," she said, her voice like ice. "I choose a man who saved my life, not one who tried to ruin it. Now, please leave my house." She turned her back on him. She sold the house. She sold the furniture, the silver, the carriages. She kept nothing but her mother's wedding band and the blue dress she had packed. She took the money, the vast, empty wealth, and she bought a ticket on the first train heading west. She was going home. Back in Wyoming, the silence had returned to Calder's cabin. It was a different kind of silence now. It was not the angry, grief-stricken quiet of before. It was a hollow, aching missing. He kept waiting to hear her voice. He kept expecting to turn and see her by the fire. He worked until his muscles burned and his hands were raw. He was rebuilding. Just as he said, he split rails and mended the corral fence, his motions sharp, almost violent. He was fighting the loneliness. One evening, he opened the chest. Ilara's things were still there, folded at the bottom, but on top was the cornflower blue dress. Annie had washed it. She had mended the long, ragged tear in the hem, her stitches small and neat, a scar of her own. She had folded it and left it for him. He picked it up. It smelled of her, of soap and wood smoke, and Annie. He held it to his face for a long, aching moment. He had not cried, not since the day she'd found him in the aspens, but he came close now. He carefully folded the dress and put it in a drawer. Not back in the chest. He put it with his own things. It was a promise. He was late checking the north fence. The sun was a smear of bloody orange behind the peaks when he rode back, the mule trailing behind him. He was tired. He was thinking of her, wondering if she was safe, if she had seen her father, if she was, at this very moment, thinking of him. He was so lost in his thoughts. He did not smell the smoke until he cleared the last ridge. He smelled it, and he smelled whiskey. He stopped his horse. His blood went cold. Down in the valley, his barn. His barn was not just smoking, it was burning. Bright, yellow flames were licking up the dry pine, eating the roof. And standing in the yard, silhouetted against the fire, was a man. He was holding a torch in one hand and a bottle in the other. "Tate," Calder breathed. The name was a curse. He kicked his horse into a run, pulling the rifle from its scabbard as he flew down the hill. "Tate!" he roared. Elijah Tate spun around. His fine suit was gone. He was in dirty clothes, his face gaunt, his eyes insane. He was drunk, and he was filled with a poisoned, vengeful rage. "Boone!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. You took her! You ruined me! You and that whore! I told her I'd be back! I told her!" He threw the torch at the cabin, but it fell short, hissing in the mud. "I'm gonna burn it all, Boone, all your little home, like you burned me." Calder threw himself from the horse before it even stopped, landing in a roll. He brought the rifle up. "It's over. Tate, get on your horse, or I'll kill you where you stand." "It's over when you're dead," Tate screamed, and he fumbled inside his coat, pulling out a big Colt revolver. He was wild, drunk, but he was fast. He fired. The shot boomed across the valley, loud as a cannon. Calder felt it. It was not a pop. Like the Derringer, it was a sledgehammer. It hit him high in the left shoulder, spinning him around, knocking the rifle from his grasp. The pain was immense, a white-hot, blinding fire that shot down his arm and exploded in his chest. He fell to his knees. His arm was dead. He could not feel it. Tate laughed, a high, thin, terrible sound. He stumbled forward, raising the pistol for a finishing shot. You see? I win. I always win. Now I'll take my time. And when she comes back, she'll find you, just like you found your wife, frozen, cold." Calder was on his knees. The barn was roaring behind him, the heat scorching his back. His rifle was 10 feet away. He was going to die. He was going to die. And Annie would come home to this. To ashes. To him. No. The word was not a thought. It was a physical force. No. As Tate raised the pistol, his drunken hand wavering, Calder lunged. He didn't use his legs. He launched himself forward from his knees. A pure, animal burst of power. A bear's charge. He hit Tate at the waist. The pistol fired, the shot going wild, flashing over Calder's head. The two men crashed to the muddy ground, rolling, fighting in the dirt and the firelight. Tate was wiry, strong with a madman's strength. He still had the gun. He brought it down, trying to pistol whip Calder. Calder blocked it with his good arm, the pain in his shoulder so vast. He was barely aware of it. He was roaring, a wordless sound of pure, killing rage. Tate's face was inches from his, spittle flying from his lips, his eyes wide. Calder's hand, his right hand, was pinned under them, but his fingers found the handle of the skinning knife on his belt. He ripped it free. He brought it up, a short, powerful, upward thrust. He put all of his weight, all of his grief, all of his rage, all of his love for Annie into that one single movement. Tate's eyes went wide. He made a sound, a low, wet gurgle. His body went rigid. And then, all the fight went out of him. He went limp. Calder shoved the body off him and scrambled to his feet, breathing in great, ragged sobs. Tate lay still, his eyes open to the burning sky. The fight was over. Tate was dead. Calder stood there, swaying. The world was tilting. The roar of the fire was suddenly very loud. His shoulder, his whole left side, was a sea of pain. He looked down. His shirt was black with blood, not dripping, pouring. The mule, his tools, the barn. He stumbled toward the burning barn. "Ha, mule," he slurred. He had to save the mule. He got to the door. The heat was a physical blow, pushing him back. He could hear the mule screaming inside, a sound of pure terror. "I'm coming." He took 2 steps in, the smoke blinding him. A huge beam, eaten through by the fire, crashed down from the loft, blocking the stall. It was too late. Calder fell back, choking, shielding his face. He had failed. Again. He stumbled away from the inferno, his boots heavy with mud. The blood there was so much blood. He was so cold, so very cold, despite the fire. He made it to the cabin porch. He fell against one of the posts. He had to stop the bleeding. He tried to unbutton his shirt with one hand, but his fingers were numb. He slid down the post, leaving a long, dark smear of blood. He landed hard on the wooden steps. He looked at the burning barn, at the dead man in his yard. He thought of Annie. She was coming home. She was coming home to this. "Annie," he whispered, to the smoke and the stars. I'm sorry." His vision went gray at the edges. The roaring of the fire faded, replaced by a high, thin ringing. He closed his eyes. Annie rode hard from Lander. She had gotten a horse, a strong bay, and she rode like a person possessed. She was home. The air was right. The sky was right. She crested the last ridge, the same ridge Calder had crested that day he'd found her. Her heart so full, it felt like it would burst. She saw the smoke. It was not a campfire. It was not his chimney. It was a black, oily plume against the bright morning sky. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no, no." She kicked the horse, driving it down the hill, her heart a cold stone of dread. She did not ride to the cabin. She rode to the source of the smoke. The barn was gone. It was a smoking, black, skeletal ruin. The smell of burnt wood and something else, something awful, hung in the air. "Calder!" she called, her voice thin with terror. "Calder!" She saw the body in the yard. She saw the dark clothes, the pale, upturned face. She screamed, a raw, tearing sound. She threw herself from the horse, stumbling in the mud, running. But it was not Calder. It was Tate, dead, his eyes open, a knife, Calder's knife, still in his chest. "Calder!" she shrieked, her head snapping around, searching. Where was he? She saw the blood trail, a thick, dark path in the mud, leading from where the fight had happened, leading to the cabin. She followed it. She ran to the porch, and she found him. He was slumped against the steps, his head on his chest. He was white, white as the snow she had lain in. He was covered in blood, his shirt, his pants. The porch beneath him, all of it was a dark, terrible red. He was not moving. "Calder! Oh, God, Calder! No!" She fell to her knees beside him. She put her hands on his face. His skin was cold, cold as marble. "No," she wept. "No, you can't. You promised. You promised you would be here." She put her ear to his chest, to the bloody, sticky shirt. She listened. Nothing. "No, don't you leave me!" she screamed, pounding on his good shoulder. "Don't you dare leave me! I'm home! Calder, I'm home!" She collapsed on top of him, her body shaking with a grief so violent. It was like the storm that had brought them together. She laid her head on his chest, and she wept, begging him, begging God, begging the mountains, to not take this man from her. Her tears, hot and fast, soaked through his shirt, warming the cold skin beneath. She felt it, a movement, a tiny, stuttering intake of breath. She raised her head. Her own breathing stopped. His eyelids fluttered. They opened. Just a crack. His eyes, unfocused and dull, found her. A faint, faint smile touched his chapped lips. His voice was not a voice. It was just a puff of air, a rustle of dry leaves. "Knew you'd come." And his eyes closed again. "Yes," she cried. "Yes, I'm here. Hold on. Calder, hold on. I am here. I will not let you go." She tore at her own skirt. She pressed the cloth against the terrible, dark hole in his shoulder. She held him, rocking him, as the sun rose higher, painting the smoking ruins of the barn in the unforgiving light of a new day. She stayed beside him. She did not sleep for 4 days. She cleaned the wound. She stitched it, her hands shaking. Just as he had stitched her clothes, she poured broth and water down his throat. She held his hand. She talked. "You will not die. Calder Boone, I have crossed a continent for you. You will not be so selfish as to die now. I have money. We will buy that land. We will build a new barn. You and me, together. You hear me?" He heard her. He held on. When he was finally strong enough to stand, his arm in a sling, his face still pale, they walked out into the yard. The body of Tate was gone. The marshal had come, had seen the scene, and had taken him away. It was ruled self-defense. All that was left was the barn, a black, charred square on the earth. "We have to bury it," Annie said. "Bury what?" he asked, his voice still weak. "The past," she said. They took shovels, and together, side by side, they began to turn the earth, burying the last of the ashes, mixing the black soot with the rich, clean dirt. They buried the ghost of Alara. They buried the shame of Judge Cartwright. They buried the violence of Elijah Tate. When they were done, the land was flat. It was just a patch of dark earth, ready for something new. Calder stood, leaning on his shovel, his good arm around her waist. "It's clean," he said. "Yes," she said, leaning her head on his uninjured shoulder. "It's clean." Summer came to the Wind River Valley like a sigh of relief. The snows vanished from all but the highest peaks, and the land turned a deep, aching green. The air, which had been a thing that cut, became a thing that warmed. And they built. With the money Annie had brought from the sale of her father's house, they bought the south parcel, the bottom land Calder had wanted. They bought a new mule, 2 strong work horses, and a wagon load of tools and seed from Lander. And they began to build the new barn. It did not go up easy. Summer in Wyoming is a short, hot promise, and they raced the calendar. Calder's left shoulder was stiff. The doctor said it would always be stiff. The bullet had torn the muscle, and it healed like knotted rope. He could not lift his arm high. So he learned to swing the axe with his right arm, his whole body turning into the blow, the muscles of his back and stomach cording with the effort. Annie worked beside him. She was not the woman who had collapsed in the snow. Her hands were hard now, calloused and brown from the sun. She hauled logs with the new mule. She mixed the chinking, mud and straw, and packed it with her own hands. She was strong, not in the way he was, but in a way that did not quit. They would work from the first gray light of dawn until the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. They ate their meals on the porch, too tired to talk, their legs dangling, their boots caked with mud. He would watch her eat, watch the steady, determined way she ate her food, and a feeling so deep, so warm, would rise in his chest. It felt like another kind of wound, a good one. The cabin was no longer a tomb. It was a home, where once it had smelled of stale smoke and old grief. It now smelled of sawdust and coffee and the wild peppermint she gathered by the creek. She had baked biscuits, and the smell of bread lingered, a ghost of comfort made real. Sometimes, in the long twilight, he would just stop. He would stop his work and watch her. She would be stacking new-cut shingles, her face smudged with dirt, her dark hair coming loose from its braid, and he would remember the woman in the snow, broken and near death. He looked at the woman before him, strong and straight and alive, and he knew, in his bones, that he was the one who had been saved. The trips to Lander for supplies were different now. The whispers were gone. It was a trip in late July that turned the town for good. A sickness had come, a bad one, that choked the life from children. The doctor was gone, over to South Pass, birthing a baby. They were in the mercantile, Calder buying nails, Annie looking at bolts of cloth, when a woman ran in. Her name was Mrs. Hemlock, a thin, nervous woman who, Annie remembered, had whispered louder than most when they had first come to town. "Mr. Hatcher, please!" the woman cried, her face a mask of terror. "It's my boy! It's Silas! He's burning up! He can't breathe!" The store went quiet. Folks called it the strangling fever. They shut their doors. They were terrified. Annie put down the bolt of calico. She looked at Calder. He saw the look. It was the same one she'd had when she told him she would not run from Tate. She walked out of the store. Calder followed her. "Ma'am," Annie said, stopping Mrs. Hemlock on the boardwalk. "I am not a doctor, but I nursed Calder through a fever. I might be able to help." "Mrs." Hemlock looked at her, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic hope. "You? But they said you—" "I can sit with him," Annie said, her voice calm and sure. "If you will let me." The woman grabbed her hands. "Please," she wept. Calder stood on the boardwalk of that small, plague-quiet house for 3 days. He just stood there, his rifle in his good arm, daring anyone to interfere, watching the door. He did not sleep. Inside, Annie fought. She recognized the gray, thick film in the boy's throat. She had seen it once, back east. She bathed the boy, hour after hour, in cool water. She forced broth between his cracked lips. She did not sleep. She just sat in the small, hot room. And she fought the fever, fought it with a cold, calm fury. On the 3rd night, the boy's breathing, which had been a ragged, terrible gasp, eased. The fever broke. When Annie walked out of the house in the gray light of dawn, she was pale as milk, swaying on her feet. Calder caught her before she fell. He just caught her and held her up. Mrs. Hemlock came out onto the porch. She looked at Annie, then at Calder. She knelt in the dirt of the street. "He is sleeping," the woman said, her voice choked. "He is sleeping. He is breathing. God bless you, ma'am. God bless you." After that, Annie Cartwright was not a stranger. She was not a runaway. She was theirs. When she walked into the mercantile, Mr. Hatcher tipped his hat. "Mrs. Boone," he said, trying the name out. Annie flushed. It is still Miss Cartwright. Mr. Hatcher." "Be that as it may," he said, smiling. "This town we are in your debt." They finished the barn in August. It was a fine, strong barn, bigger than the old one. Calder stood looking at it, his hand on the new, smooth pine of the door. "It's a good barn," he said. "It is our barn," Annie said, slipping her hand into his. He looked at her. Her hand was hard and calloused, a perfect match for his. "Annie," he said, his voice rough, I think we should make this right, proper. I don't want you to be Miss Cartwright no more. Unless you want to be." "I do not want to be," she whispered, her eyes shining. "I want to be yours." They did not get married in a church. They did not have pomp, or music, or guests. They got married in the field behind the cabin, where the wild sunflowers grew so thick it looked like a carpet of gold. The sky was a high, cloudless blue. The Wind River Mountains stood to the west, a row of silent, ancient witnesses. Marshall Thorne rode out. He wore his Sunday suit, and he held a small, worn Bible in his hands. He looked nervous, more nervous than when he'd faced down Tate. "You're sure about this? You two?" he asked, looking from one to the other. "I've never been more sure of anything," Calder said. Annie wore the blue dress, Ilara's dress, the one she had worn into battle, the one stained with his blood. She had mended it, and she wore it with pride. It was not a dress of ghosts. It was a dress of survival. Calder, he just looked like Calder. He had trimmed his beard. He wore a clean shirt. His good arm was strong. His bad arm rested easy. His eyes, once so cold and gray, were clear, and they never left her face. They stood in the sunflowers. Marshall Thorne read the words. His voice was the only sound, besides the wind in the pines. "Do you, Calder Boone, take this woman?" Calder did not wait for the end. He turned to Annie, and he took both her hands in his. "I buried my heart once," he said, his voice thick, breaking. "I put it in the ground, up on that hill." He nodded toward the small aspen cross, visible in the distance. "I swore it was gone. I swore I was dead. I was just a mean, frozen thing." He squeezed her hands. "And then you came. You fell out of the sky. And you dug it up, Annie. You melted the ice. You brought me back. You brought my heart back. I love you. I will love you until they put me back in that ground." Annie was weeping, silent tears that ran down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "And do you, Annabelle Cartwright?" the marshal started, his own voice thick. Annie turned to Calder. "When I came here," she whispered, "I was a ghost. I had no name. I had no home. I was nothing. I was just shame. And you gave me a home. You gave me a rifle. You gave me your name to protect. You gave me you." She reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a small, carved object. It was crude, whittled from a piece of aspen, but the shape was clear. It was a woman, in a long dress, her hand held out, and beside her, a tiny, small shape, a child. I'm not as good at it as you," she said, remembering the small animals he whittled. "But I found this piece of wood, and I wanted to make something." She pressed it into his big, rough palm. "One day," she whispered, her voice full of a fierce, trembling hope. "One day, we will make this real." Calder's hand closed over the small carving, so tight his knuckles went white. He could not speak. He just pulled her to him. He pulled her against his chest, his good arm wrapping around her like steel. And he kissed her. He kissed her with the mountains and the sky, and the marshal as his witness. Marshal Thorne cleared his throat. "Well," he said, snapping the Bible shut, "by the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory, I now pronounce you well. I pronounce you well and truly wed." That night, there was no fear. There were no ghosts. There was only the sound of the wind and the quiet, steady breathing of two people who had found each other in the dark. Summer faded. Autumn came, sharp and bright. The days grew short. The aspens in the clearing turned a brilliant, burning gold. They worked, storing food. The new barn was full of hay. The cabin was stocked with wood, floor to ceiling. They were ready for the winter. They were ready. One morning, Calder woke up. The cabin was cold. The fire was low. He reached out. The spot beside him in the bed was empty. He sat up, a moment of the old, cold fear touching him. "Annie?" He heard no sound. He got up, pulling on his trousers, his feet bare on the cold wood floor. He saw her. She was not by the fire. She was sitting in the rocking chair, the one he'd built for her. She was just sitting, in the pre-dawn gray. She was wearing her nightgown, and she had a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was staring at something in her lap. He walked toward her, quiet. "Annie, you all right? You cold?" She didn't seem to hear him. He came to stand beside her. He looked down. She was holding a tiny pair of booties. They were sewn, not knitted, sewn from the softest, whitest piece of buckskin he had, the one he'd been saving. Her stitches were small and neat. They were so small, impossibly small. He stared at them, the small blue mitten, the grave on the hill, the burning shirt, the carved figure in his pocket. It all rushed through him, a lifetime of pain and loss. And now this. He did not speak. He could not speak. He slowly knelt in front of her. He was a big man, and he knelt at her feet. He looked at her face, Her eyes were wide, and they were shining with tears. She looked terrified, and she looked full of a fierce, bright joy. He put his big, calloused hand on her belly, over the thin cotton of her nightgown. And then he leaned forward. He pressed his lips, his rough, bearded face, to her stomach. He kissed her, a simple, reverent, and shaking kiss. He stayed there for a long time, his head resting against her. "Thank you," he whispered. The words were choked, broken, but they were the most honest words he had ever spoken. She put her hand on his head, her fingers tangling in his hair, holding him. "No," she whispered, her own voice breaking. "Thank you, Calder." The story does not end there. It does not end at all. It ends with a beginning. It ends with the two of them, riding out, a week later. The first snows had kissed the high peaks, but the valley was still clear. They were riding their horses, side by side, checking the land, their land. She looked over at him, the man who had been a frozen, angry shell. His face was turned to the mountains, his gray eyes clear. He was not smiling, but he was at peace. He looked at her, the woman who had been a broken, shamed ghost. She was sitting tall in her saddle, the wind pulling at her hair, her face turned to the sun. He reached out, his gloved hand covering hers on the pommel. She laced her fingers with his. They rode out, together, beneath the vast, endless, and silent Wyoming sky. They were no longer angry. They were no longer afraid. They were just home. Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West Campfire. We truly hope you enjoyed it. Please comment below and let us know where you are listening from so you can connect with other folks. Do not forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel. And please, share your thoughts on Calder and Annie's journey.